All right, so what we just did was created a letterhead. Now what we want to do is we want to actually create the business letter. So the first thing that you want to do when we go back into our letterhead is that we want to change the file from being our letterhead to being our actual letter. So the very first thing that we want to do is we want to click on to File. We want to click on to Save As, and we want to give it a new name. And the new name that we want to give it, I don't remember if I specified. Nope, we didn't. So we want to call this maybe the Samaras letter or the business letter. Business letter. So we have one file that is the letterhead and one file that is the actual business letter. Okay. All right. So now that we have our letter and stuff, what we want to do is we want to insert the date. So to insert the date, because we are doing the modified block style, which is the cooler looking business letter, we want the date and the signature and the complementary close to all be at 4 inches from the left. So to do that, because we created our tab to be at 4 inches, all we need to do is hit tab and it'll already be there. So when we do tab, we then want to insert the current date. And there are a couple of ways that you can do this. One way you can do this is you can go on the way the book is telling you, which is on insert. You can then go to date and time, which is this little thing that looks like a calendar, and click onto it. And then you can select the February 20th, 2020 and click OK. And that's one way that you could do it. You could also just type it in and it would automatically type it in. The other thing is that if this is something that you would want to have it automatically update, you can tick the box that says update automatically. And then what that does is it checks to see what the current date and time is, and it updates it to the current date and time. Now, in a business letter, you usually don't want to do that. You usually want it to be whatever the date is when you're writing it. You don't want it to just automatically update itself. But for other things, it can be useful. Anyway, we want to put in our date, and then we want to press return. And again, if I turn on my paragraph markings, you can see exactly how many returns I have made. In the modified block style, you always put one space after the start of your document where the date is. Then there is 2 lines worth of space, or if it's a double space, 1 double space worth of space. And then you put in the person that you are writing it to. It's called the inside address and salutation. So the inside address is always going to be the person to whom you are writing. And when you're writing to a person, you always want to include their title. So if you don't know what their title is, then if it's a man, you usually want to say Mr., so MR. If it's a woman, unless you know for a fact that the woman prefers to be referred to as M, a specific way, you usually want to put in as MS period. So even if you know for a fact that she's married and she, unless you know that she prefers to be MRS, you would want to do MS. On the other hand, if she has a PhD, you'd want to say doctor. If she's a professor, you'd want to say professor. So whatever title it is that is appropriate for that person is what you want to put in the when you're putting in the name. So in this case, it's Ms. Lucy Song, and she is at the Washington Volunteer Foundation at 10 Hickory Avenue in Midway, Washington, 98476. So that's the address. Then you want to put in a blank space and then the salutation. So the salutation is going to be, usually you'd say, dear so-and-so, dear Ms. Song. And then it's a colon, not a comma. So that's one of the differences between a business letter and a friendly letter. That in a friendly letter, you usually do a comma. In a business letter, it's always a colon. Now, the book is telling you on page 170 to create a building block. Personally, I don't like building blocks. I prefer to do the in your file options in proofing to do autocorrect anytime that you want to have a special thing. So what the other option is to create what's called a building block. And if you want to know how to do a building block, it's on pages 170 to 171. To then insert a building block, you have to press the F3 key, and then as well as the letters that are associated with the building block. I think that building blocks are not as useful as creating an autocorrect. And if you look on page 172 at the bottom, they're telling you that the difference between building block versus autocorrect. I actually think the autocorrect is a much better way of doing it than doing building blocks. That said, building blocks can be useful, but I think that autocorrect is more useful. So there it is. So on page 172, we're actually going to write the letter. So to write the letter, there needs to be, again, another blank space after the salutation. And your letter always is going to be left side. So we're going to say, thank you for meeting with me this morning to discuss the mentoring position available at the Washington Volunteer Foundation. Now, what they're suggesting that you do is, again, to do WVF and associate WVF as a building block for Washington Volunteer Foundation. If you're going to really do that, I think the better thing to do would be to go into file options, to go into proofing, to go into autocorrect options, and then in the replace, to replace WVF with Washington Volunteer Foundation. And then what that would do is that would then mean that when you type in WVF, it would make it say Washington Volunteer Foundation. I think that's a much better way of doing it.
Could you please do it? Could you please repeat this thing from option, 5 options?
Well, we did it 3 weeks ago. But again, it's file and then options and then proofing and then autocorrect options. And then you replace the text with whatever you want to replace it with. But again, in this instance, I think it's kind of silly to do either because we're only doing it once. It's only really a useful thing to create a building block or to create an autocorrect entry if you're going to reuse it over and over again. If you're only going to do it once, it's faster to type in the actual content. All right, so the next thing that they're wanting us to do is they're wanting us to insert a non-breaking space. Now, the thing about a non-breaking space is that I think they're right. We should insert a non-breaking space. But I don't think the non-breaking space should be placed at the spot that the book is telling us to put it in. I think I mentioned this before. I don't really love the way the book tells you how to do things because sometimes they tell you how to do things that are just ridiculous. So the problem that I have with this sentence as it's written right at the moment is that the words Washington and volunteer are on one line and the word foundation is on another line. And that doesn't look good. Visually, that's not a good way of doing it. So there are 2 different methods that I think would be better. So if you're typing or working on something else, I want you to stop for a moment and look up at my screen because I'm going to show you how to do it differently than the way that the book is showing you how to do it. And so, so what I am suggesting is that the words Washington Volunteer Foundation should actually be on a new line. Because in reading this, it breaks up Washington Volunteer Foundation because foundation's on its own line. So there are 2 different methods that can be used. One method is to create what is called a non-breaking space. The other is to create what's called a line break. So I'm going to show you the line break method first, and then I'm going to show you the non-breaking space method. So line breaks, so normally when you press enter, it creates paragraphs. Creates a little paragraph symbol here when I have the paragraphs turning on. If I press enter, it'll think that this is a new paragraph. And that's not really what I want. I don't want it to be a new paragraph. I want it to be within this paragraph, a new line. I'm sorry?
Like if it has a lot of dots, like mine has a lot of dots.
Well, they should. They should have a lot of dots if you're doing that because dots are spaces. So again, if you turn off the paragraph markings, the dots will disappear. The dots indicate that you put in a space. And the reason I have it on right at the moment is because I wanted to show you that when I hit return, it's treating this as a paragraph. And the reason that that's a problem is that if I go into my paragraph settings and I say after every paragraph, put in don't do this, put in a bunch of spaces, then it means that after every paragraph, it will it will put in, oops, I have to tell it to do, did I not tell the whole thing? I didn't tell the whole thing, that's why. If I tell it to put it in, it's going to put in a whole bunch of spaces after this paragraph. And I don't want it to be in a new paragraph. I just want it to be on this new line. So there's a better way of making it go onto a new line. And that is that instead of hitting return, if I hold down my shift key and I press return or enter, it creates what's called a line break. You see the difference? So if I do a regular return, it treats it as a new paragraph, which I've said is supposed to have a bunch of space between the paragraphs. It's not, but I'm making it do that. Whereas if I do shift and enter, it creates a line break, meaning go on to the next line, but stay within this paragraph. And instead of there being a paragraph symbol, it now has this little rounded arrow symbol. All right, let me revert this back to what it's supposed to be. All right. So one method of putting this on its own line would be to do shift and enter, and it would go onto its own line. That's one way of doing it. The problem with this method is that it works, but it just happens to work in this instance. Because if I start to add more text on here, then it means that it's still going to make this flop onto its own line, and I don't really want this to flop onto its own line now. I'd want it to be part of the continuation. So there's another way of doing it, and this is what's called a non-breaking space. And this is on page 173. And to create a non-breaking space, what you do is on a Windows machine, you do Control Shift Spacebar. On a Mac, it is Option Shift Spacebar, I think. Maybe it's Control. Maybe it is Control. It's either Option Shift Spacebar or Control Shift Spacebar. Let me see. On the Mac, fire up my Mac real fast. And so what I want to do is between the word Washington and volunteer, I want to not have a regular space. And let me zoom in so I can show you the difference between how it looks. So I want to delete the regular space that's between Washington and volunteer. And instead I want to do Control Shift Space. And you'll notice that instead of it having a little dot, it now has a little circle. And similarly, between volunteer and foundation, I don't want that to have a space. I want that to have a non-breaking space, which again is Control Shift Space. Yeah, on a Mac, it is Control Shift Space. It's Control Shift Space on both Mac and Windows. And what this does is this means that if the words Washington Volunteer Foundation cannot all fit on one line, it'll bounce it to the next line. But visually, it will look like there is a space between the N and V and the R and F. So visually, it looks like I hit spacebar, but in reality, I did a non-breaking space between them. And so what this does is that if it fits on one line, great. But if it doesn't, then it'll go on to the next line. So on here, as long as it fits on here, it'll be fine on that. But once it goes beyond that, then the whole thing goes onto one line. So what is it that our thing is supposed to say? It's supposed to say, thank you for meeting with me this morning to discuss the mentoring position at Washington let's see now. Thank you for meeting with me this morning to discuss the mentoring position available at. That's why. And then the next line should say, I truly enjoyed our conversation and am excited about the possibility of volunteering with your branch center team. And the reason that I think this is a better way of doing it is because the words on Washington Volunteer Foundation are an actual thing. Branch center, I mean, branch center is not a, it doesn't make as much sense to make that be the standalone piece. And then what we want to do is we want to say the table below outlines my volunteer service background. And then a colon. And we want to put in a blank line. And we want to insert a table. So a table is used to put content into rows and columns. And so to insert a table, we just do insert and then table. And then we can choose how big we want the table to be. So you can set it to be whatever size table that you want your table to be with, however many rows and columns that it's supposed to be. In this case, they want it to be a 3x1 table. We want to insert a 3x1 table. And in our 3x1 table, we then want to enter in on the first line, we want to enter is organization. And then we want to hit tab. And we want to put in primary responsibility. And then term of service. And then we want to enter in the rest of the information on the table, which is on page 176. So we just hit tab to go to the next line. Branch, center, school district, and tutor, and 6 years. Newton County Youth Groups, teen leader,
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
I am grading the letterheads right now, and I found an error on one of the students, on one of yours, somebody. Correct it and resubmit, but the error in the letter, I won't have you resubmit it because you're resubmitting it in the letterhead only. So you don't have to fix it once you submit the letter, okay? And I ignored the letterhead once I graded on the letterhead, on the letter. Okay, if you want to correct it, fine, but correct the letterhead that you just submitted only. Okay, because I won't mark it wrong in the letter, because I already graded it once. Sometimes I get to the letterhead before you guys, after you guys put in the letter, so. Proofread, proofread, proofread. Okay.
Okay. So the next thing that they want us to do is they want us to make our boring looking table look awesome. So to make our boring looking table look awesome, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're in our table. And then in Table Tools, there is an option in Table Tools to allow us to have a table style. And these are the table styles. If we click on the More button, the table style they want us to use is the Grid Table 6 Colorful Accent 1, which I think is this guy. Yeah, this is the one that they want us to use. So we click onto that, and our table then is going to start to look better, but not all the way better. In the design, on one of the things over here is where it says table style options. And what we want is we want the first column to not be bolded. So we want to uncheck first column. And instead, we just want the header row and banded rows to be selected.
Can you go over it again, please?
Yeah, so I'm in my table. I click on a table tools. In table styles, I pick the desired table style. And then I make sure that only header row and banded rows are checked. All right, page 178. If I select my table again and I go to layout, so instead of being in design table tools, I'm in layout table tools, there is an option called auto fit. And in auto fit, if I choose auto fit contents, that will auto fit the contents, or it'll change the widths of the columns to fit the content. And inside of the table, they want the terms of service to be centered. So again, the keyboard shortcut to do center is Control E. So if I select terms of service, I can make terms of service centered. Then let's see what else they want us to change. I think that is it. To select the entire table, I can click on this little icon right here. So the little one that has a crosshairs. And then if I do a Control E again, it'll center the table.
Can you put the best button and
Which one?
the last one? Or just move it?
I just centered it.
Oh, okay, okay.
Center. Control E to center. All right, the next thing that they want us to do is they want us to insert a row above this row. So to insert a row above this row, there are several ways that you can do it. One way to do that is when you're in the row, to click the button up here that says rows and columns, insert above. That will insert a row above. Another way to do it is that if I right click, I can then do insert, and then I can say insert rows above. It's another way that I could do it. Once I've inserted the rows above that, the next thing that I want to do is I want to merge my cells. I want to merge these three cells together because I want to make them become, instead of being 3 cells, I want them to be one giant cell. So to make them be one giant cell, I select these 3 cells, and then I click on the button that says Merge Cells. That will then merge those cells into one cell. And then I want that to say Volunteer Service Background. So all of this is on page 182. The next thing they want us to do is they want organization primary responsibility in terms of service to be bolded. So I need to select those and then bold them. Either by doing a Control B or doing home and then bold. Once I'm done with my table, the next thing that we want to do is we want to put in a blank line. So I press enter, and they want us to type in, as you requested, below is my availability by day. And then they're suggesting that that you use the asterisk and then a space, because that will automatically convert it into a bullet. I think that's kind of silly. I say just click on a bullet. But if you want to, you can do star space, and that indeed will create bullets, or you could just click on bullet. And in the bullet, the first bullet is supposed to say, on page 185, it's supposed to say Mondays, and then with space dash space, 6:00A.M to 8:00 a.m. And then press enter, and then we want Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4:00 p.m. to 6:00 p.m. Saturdays from 11:00 a.m. to 2:00 p.m. Then we want to hit enter, and then we want to hit enter again because we're done with the bullets. And then there's one more paragraph that we need to write. And that one more paragraph that we need to write, so we need to hit enter again because we put a new paragraph on its own line. And that is, as a mentor for, and then they want us to put in Washington Volunteer Foundation. So because I've made it into an autocorrect, I could just do VC or WCV, which one? How did I do it? Washington, what is it called? Washington WVF, that's right. As a mentor for Washington Volunteer Foundation, comma, I would also be available by phone anytime, day or night. Please contact me if you need additional information. I look forward to hearing from you regarding this opportunity. And then we want to press enter, and then enter again because we want there to be a blank space. And then we want our closing to be lined up with our date. So because we had created that tab before, we should be able to just hit tab, and it should be lined up with the date. And we want to say sincerely. And then depending on how many enters you need, depends on how big your signature is. So most people can sign in a spot that is about 3 or 4 spaces. So if you're normal, you'd want to do 3 or 4 spaces. If your name was John Hancock, then you might need a bunch more, because John Hancock on the Declaration of Independence signed his name really big, like this. So if you sign your name like John Hancock does, did, then I would suggest, you probably are going to need like, a bunch. If you're a normal human, 3 or 4 is going to be plenty. And then you put in your name. Now, in this case, you're not going to put in your name because this is Alexander Samaras. So you want to put in Alexander Samaras's name. Alexander Samaras.
No middle name? Just what, first name and
It depends. It depends on how you prefer to be referred to. So if you always go by first name, middle name, last name, then you'd put it all in there. If you usually go by first name, middle initial, last name, you put that in there. If you usually go by just first name, last name, you put that in there. However you prefer to be referred to, that's how you would do it in your professional capacity, not as your friend. So if your name, in the case of Alexander Samaras, if he normally goes by Alex, it would not be appropriate for him to do Alex. It would be appropriate for him to say Alexander Samaras. When he signs his name, he might sign it as Alex. And then that way the person who's reading it would know, oh, Alexander prefers to be named, be known as Alex probably. If your name is Monica, but you go by Mo, well then, you'd want to spell it out Monica, but you might want to sign it Mo. Same kind of thing. Now, there are a couple of other things that I want to tell you about that are not in the book that I think are important to know about business letters. And one of those things is that what if you are you are typing up a business letter for your boss? Well, what you're supposed to do in that case is that on the next line over, you're supposed to put in the initials of whoever typed it with a slash and then whatever the Alexander, in this case, if I did it, I would do something like MWB, whoops, not that, MWB/AS, because I'm saying that I typed this for Alexander Samaras. Or sometimes they just, people just put in their initials. And that indicates to whoever receives the letter to know that it wasn't really written by them. It was really written by their secretary or whatever. And so that's what that is. The other thing that often is put into a business letter is ENC. ENC means that there is an enclosure that is being added to the, that's being enclosed with the letter. So if you were putting in, say, you're putting, it's for a business, and you're putting in like the purchase order. You would say something like in the business letter, you might say, please see attached business, purchase order number 49278. We'd like you to pay it as soon as possible. Love and kisses, Mark. And then ENC. Then the ENC would be where it would be indicating that there's an enclosure that they should be looking for in with the business letter. Now in this case, there is no enclosure, so we don't need to put it in there. But that's something that often is put in business letters. Questions? All right. The last thing I wanted to tell you is that in your book, on page 187, it talks about addressing and printing envelopes and mailing letters, mailing labels. So I will tell you this. So the book is not wrong on showing you how to do it, but I will tell you that almost never do you want to insert an envelope in your printer. So almost never is it right to print an envelope. And the reason you don't want to do that is that it will ruin your printer. And the reason it will ruin your printer is because printers are designed to print one page at a time. If you think about what an envelope is a folded piece of paper that's folded like 4 times. Because you got the flap, you got the bottom part, you got the other side. So I guess it's really 3 times. So it's like sticking in 3 pieces of paper at once. Now, if you only do it once in a while, it probably isn't going to hurt your printer that much. But if you do it often enough, it will cause your printer to break. So rather than doing that, I strongly recommend that you do address labels instead. Peel off the address label and stick the address label on your envelope instead. And what I will show you is that it's really easy to create them. So I'm just going to create a new document. And to create an address label, it's done by clicking on to mailings and then labels. Again, I strongly advise you never, ever, ever click on envelopes unless you want to break your printer. And then when you do labels, what you would do is you would pick you'd put in the address. So, you know, what's his address or her address? It's what? Ms. Lucy Song at Washington. You don't have to do this.
On my book, when you open that window, when you put labels, the address and all the information goes up there.
Then it means that somebody, that means that you had copied and you had selected it already.
Oh.
Foundation, and she's at 10 Hickory Avenue, and this is at Midway, Washington, 98476. Yeah, if you had selected it ahead of time and then clicked on the labels, it would automatically select that. Now, in terms of the label, you'll notice that it's flipped over on the side there, and that's because I haven't chosen the type of label that I want. So I have to click on the options, and when you click on the options, you then pick the style of label that your labels are. So whatever the label style is, you pick the correct label style, and then you can then click on a new document. And when you click on a new document, it's going to create the labels for you. And then you would hit print. Well, first you would put the labels into the printer, hit print, and it would then print those labels.
Can I make a suggestion on labels?
Yes, suggestion on
I
labels.
have been experienced in it.
Yes.
Anytime you stick a label in a printer, place an X on a blank piece of paper first. Place it in the printer. Okay? When it prints, you should see the X on top. Okay? If you don't see the X on top, you may buy yourself a new printer because you put the labels in the wrong way. Because these labels on a laser printer, they get real hot going through. And they will melt and get stuck on the roller. On an inkjet, laser jet, will do the same thing.
Yep.
One of my old printers took me 3 months to get the labels out. I stuck it in the wrong way. I had to wait till they dried to get them off. Laser, We had a laser in our business building over there. That happened to me again. We had a teacher who put a transparency in a laser. She used a regular transparency that goes on those machines, not a laser transparency. When she put that laser that goes through that machine,
And it melted the
on the
paper. Yeah.
roller.
Yeah.
Okay, little things like that, I don't recommend doing, unless it says laser on it.
Yeah.
Or inkjet, especially transparency. Okay, because she thought she was gonna make a copy to show students of the transparency machine, but she put the wrong one in there. Okay, label, be careful. Usually on here, it'll tell you how to put an envelope in here or something, because the letters are facing, or it'll show you in there with this pull back with a sketch goes down this way. It'll show you on the which way to put the paper. What I do first, I always put an X and run it through first with a piece of paper. If you print on the X, I know I put it in right. Okay? Be careful. I've had experience, okay? When I first moved in this computer lab, that's when it happened. Brand new little printer that I bought. Portable one for traveling. Took me 3 months to get that label off because it was so stuck in there. After a while, they do dry up. We can just pull them off the screen. Have you ever had that experience?
I have melted many a printer before, and that's why I said,
Yeah.
the reason I'm telling you don't put in don't put in envelopes in a printer is not because I have never done it before. It's because I have done it before, and I have broken many printers doing it.
You want
And-
to typewriter yet? When we
Yeah.
first learned how to do label printers. We didn't use printers. We had everybody type on typewriters.
Yeah.
That's part of the exercise.
Anyway, all right. So this is the end of part number 2. So I need to make sure that I am saving this as my business letter and not as my letterhead, right? Because the letterhead is the letter without the letter. And then the letter is the letterhead with the letter. So I'm saving this as my business letter. And then once I've done that, I can then submit my part 2. Oops, how about if I
Call letterhead boilerplate. How they use them
submit
in
my
communication.
letter, and then I will be all done with part number 2. So as I said in the beginning, the stuff that we did today is we did the create the letterhead and create the business letter. Your homework is to do pages 190 to 191, which is to create the October work schedule. And then pages 194 to 195 is to create the Bugbees Fitness Club business letter and letterhead. So that is the assignment. And with that, we have come to the end of Microsoft Word. So there are a couple of other things that I wanted to point out to you. One of them is that we do indeed have, I know that you're going to be super excited about this. We do indeed have the midterm on Microsoft Word up and ready for you to enjoy and take part on. It is a 100 question multiple choice exam. As I said, make sure that you have read the research paper resources and the autocorrect and the styles versus direct formatting, as well as everything that is in the books.
Also, when he tells you, remember this.
Yeah. And to take the quiz, you just click on to take the quiz. You have as much time as you want to work on it until the due date. When's the due date?
Me too.
Exactly, May the 22nd. So as long as you do not press the submit button down at the bottom, you can enter in stuff and it will record whatever you have done. But it won't become, turned in until you click on the submit quiz.
Is that the one that you have to go back and get?
I'm sorry?
Is that the test you have to go back and get?
No, this one, as soon as you hit submit, you'll know what your grade is.
Automatically.
This one grades itself.
And I also don't have midterms because it's open book.
Mhm.
I do not have it. Then I want to clarify it for you, but I will not give you the answer.
Yeah. All right. The other thing is that in our assignments area, I also have posted our Microsoft Word extra credit assignment. So if you click onto the extra credit assignment and you want to get 10 extra bonus points, then you can create the pet party in the park. Now, unlike a regular assignment, you can't turn it in and then get extra point, get a regrade on it. So
No resubmit.
no resubmits on extra credit or on exams.
You have a picture what it's supposed to look.
This is what it should look like. It could be any picture. It does not have to be this picture. Be any picture
Similar. Yeah.
that tells you what it's supposed to look like. Questions? Other than why is it not working on my screen?
I have a question.
Okay,
The letter we were doing,
okay.
I got stuck in the part of the squares to change the color.
Squares.
No,
On the table?
Yeah.
On the table, okay.
So how do you take those lines out? 'Cause I have two lines in the middle. The value.
So in the table tools, we want this one to be the one that's chosen. And then you want to make sure that only header row and banded rows are selected. Otherwise, that should be it.
Should be green and white, that's right. That's it.
All right, like I said, I'm going to come around and help anybody that needs any individual help, but otherwise we've come to the end of the stuff that I wanted to talk about tonight. What we're going to do next week is we're going to start talking about Excel. So that'll be the fun and excitement for next week is Excel chapter 1. That'll be the fun for next time.